The autumn of 1837 brought an unusual chill to Blackwood Plantation, nestled deep in the Mississippi Delta, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a perpetually gray sky. Master Cornelius Blackwood stood on his manor's wraparound porch, watching as the latest shipment of enslaved people was unloaded from the river barge. Among them were two young girls, no more than 12 years old, who immediately caught his attention, not for their youth, but for the way they moved. The twins walked in perfect synchronization, their bare feet touching the muddy ground at precisely the same moment. Their dark eyes swept across the plantation with an intelligence that made Blackwood's overseer, Thomas Garrett, shift uncomfortably. When one twin turned her head to observe the cotton fields, the other mirrored the movement exactly, as if they shared a single consciousness. "Peculiar children," Garrett muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Never seen twins move like that. It ain't natural." Blackwood nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes fixed on the girls. He had owned this plantation for 15 years, inherited from his father, along with its reputation for breaking even the most defiant spirits. The Blackwood name was synonymous with control, with the absolute dominion over every soul who worked these fields. Yet something about these twins made him uneasy. The slave trader, a weathered man named Josiah Crane, approached with his ledger. "Those two there are Zara and Kaya," he said, pointing to the twins. "Came from a plantation in Louisiana. Previous owner was eager to sell them." "Why?" Blackwood asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Crane's eyes darted nervously toward the girls, who had stopped walking and now stood perfectly still, their heads tilted at identical angles as they listened to the conversation. Strange things happened around them. Accidents, sickness. The other slaves started whispering about curses and such nonsense. Blackwood scoffed, but his gaze remained fixed on the twins. Superstitious foolishness. Their children, nothing more. As if responding to his words, both twins turned their heads toward him simultaneously. Their dark eyes met his across the distance, and for a moment, Blackwood felt something cold crawl up his spine. The girls' expressions were blank, but there was an ancient quality to their stare, as if they were looking through him rather than at him. "Put them in the quarters with the other field hands," Blackwood ordered, turning away. "And make sure they understand the rules here. I don't tolerate any disruption to my operations." Garrett nodded and approached the twins with two other overseers. "You two, come along. Time you learned how things work at Blackwood Plantation." The twins followed without resistance, their movements still eerily synchronized. As they walked toward the slave quarters, a row of cramped wooden cabins that housed nearly 200 enslaved people, whispers began to spread among the other workers. Old Sarah, who had been at the plantation longer than anyone could remember, crossed herself and muttered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, protect us," she whispered to her daughter Mercy. "I seen twins before, but never like that. They move like they got one soul between them." The quarters fell silent as Zara and Kaya were assigned to a small cabin they would share with 3 other young women. The twins said nothing, but their presence seemed to change the very air around them. Children who had been playing stopped their games and stared. Adults found excuses to look elsewhere, unable to meet the twins' penetrating gaze. That first night, as the plantation settled into its usual rhythm of exhausted sleep, something extraordinary happened. Martha, a woman in her 30s who suffered from a chronic cough that had plagued her for months, found herself breathing clearly for the first time in memory. She sat up in her bunk, touching her throat in amazement, and noticed the twins sitting by the small window in their cabin, their silhouettes perfectly aligned against the moonlight. They were humming, a low, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into the bones of everyone who heard it. The melody was unlike anything heard in the quarters before, neither a work song nor a spiritual, but something older, something that seemed to come from a place beyond memory. As the humming continued, other miraculous things began to happen. Old Ben's arthritic hands, gnarled and painful from decades of cotton picking, found their stiffness easing. Little Emma, who had been running a fever for days, felt her temperature break. Throughout the quarters, people experienced small healings, subtle improvements that they would later attribute to divine intervention. But in the main house, Master Blackwood tossed and turned in his four-poster bed, plagued by vivid nightmares of drowning in an endless sea of cotton, while phantom voices whispered his name in languages he didn't recognize. When he finally woke, drenched in sweat, the humming had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered until dawn. The twins had been at Blackwood Plantation for less than 24 hours, and already the delicate balance of power that had existed for decades was beginning to shift in ways that no one could yet comprehend. 3 weeks into their stay at Blackwood Plantation, Zara and Kaya had established themselves as the most efficient cotton pickers in the fields, despite their young age. Their small fingers moved through the bolls with supernatural speed and precision, and their daily yield consistently exceeded that of workers twice their size. This efficiency, however, came with an unsettling quality that made even the other enslaved people uncomfortable. The twins never spoke to each other, yet they worked in perfect coordination. When Zara reached the end of a row, Kaya would already be moving to the next section. If one twin needed water, the other would produce a gourd before any request was made. Their synchronization extended beyond mere cooperation. It was as if they shared a single mind, distributed across 2 bodies. Overseer Thomas Garrett had been watching them carefully, looking for any sign of defiance or laziness that would justify the harsh discipline he was known for. But the twins gave him no such opportunity. They followed orders immediately, worked without complaint, and never showed the slightest hint of rebellion. This compliance, rather than pleasing Garrett, only increased his suspicion. "There's something wrong with those two," he confided to his assistant, a brutal man named Pike, who took pleasure in finding reasons to use his whip. "No slave works that hard without being driven to it, and the way they move together, it ain't natural." Pike nodded, his scarred hands flexing around the handle of his whip. "Want me to test them, see how they respond to proper motivation?" Garrett considered this. The plantation's discipline system was built on fear and pain, designed to break the spirit of anyone who might harbor thoughts of resistance. Every enslaved person at Blackwood had felt the sting of the whip at least once, and most had learned to live in constant awareness of its threat. The twins, however, seemed somehow immune to this atmosphere of terror. "Tomorrow," Garrett decided. "Find a reason. I want to see how they react when separated." The opportunity came the following afternoon when Kaya's cotton sack developed a small tear. It was a minor issue, easily repaired, but Pike seized upon it as evidence of carelessness. He ordered Kaya to report to the punishment post, a wooden structure in the center of the quarters where public whippings served as lessons for all to witness. For the first time since their arrival, the twins' synchronization faltered. As Pike grabbed Kaya's arm to drag her away, Zara stopped picking cotton and turned toward her sister. The movement was subtle, but every person in the field felt it. A sudden shift in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Keep working!" Garrett shouted at Zara, but she continued to stare at her sister with an intensity that made him step backward involuntarily. At the punishment post, Pike bound Kaya's wrists to the wooden beam and raised his whip. A crowd of enslaved people gathered, as was required, to witness the discipline, but as Pike brought the whip down across Kaya's back, something impossible happened. The leather struck her skin with its usual vicious crack, but no mark appeared. Kaya didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't show any sign that she had been touched. Pike stared at her back in confusion, then raised the whip again, putting more force behind the blow. Again, nothing. The whip made contact, everyone could hear it, but Kaya's skin remained unmarked. Murmurs began to spread through the crowd, whispers of disbelief and growing fear. "What kind of devil's work is this?" Pike snarled, raising the whip a third time, but before he could strike, every person in the crowd turned to look toward the cotton fields, drawn by an instinct they couldn't explain. Zara was walking toward them, moving with the same measured pace she always maintained. But something had changed. The air around her seemed to shimmer with heat, despite the cool autumn weather. Other workers stepped aside as she passed, not from fear of punishment, but from a deeper, more primal instinct that warned them to give her space. When Zara reached the punishment post, she simply stood beside her sister. Pike, his face red with frustration and confusion, raised the whip toward Zara instead. "You want to share her punishment? Fine by me." But as the whip descended, it stopped mid-air, as if caught by an invisible hand. Pike pulled at it, his muscles straining, but the leather remained suspended, trembling with tension. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Pike's face turned purple with effort, veins bulging in his neck as he fought against whatever force held his weapon. Then, without warning, the whip was released. Pike stumbled backward, the sudden lack of resistance sending him sprawling in the dirt. The whip landed beside him, its leather cracked and split as if it had been struck by lightning. Garrett pushed through the crowd, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "What's happening here?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The twins looked at him with their dark, ancient eyes, and Garrett felt the same chill that Master Blackwood had experienced on their first day. Without a word, Zara untied her sister's bonds, and together they walked back toward the cotton fields, their movements once again perfectly synchronized. The crowd dispersed slowly, people returning to their work with hushed conversations and fearful glances. But the damage was done. Word of what had happened spread through the quarters like wildfire, and by evening, every enslaved person at Blackwood Plantation knew that something had changed. In the main house, Garrett reported the incident to Master Blackwood, though he struggled to find words that would make the event sound believable. Blackwood listened with growing unease, his fingers drumming against his desk as he processed the implications. "You're telling me that a whip couldn't mark them?" Blackwood asked, his voice carefully controlled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, sir. I saw it with my own eyes. The leather struck true, but it was like hitting stone. No marks, no blood, nothing." Blackwood stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the quarters where lamplight flickered in the small cabins. Somewhere out there, two young girls were challenging everything he believed about power and control. The thought should have angered him, but instead it filled him with a cold dread that he couldn't shake. "Double the guard tonight," he ordered, "and tomorrow we try a different approach." But even as he spoke, Blackwood suspected that conventional methods would prove useless against whatever force protected the twins. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that there were some things that couldn't be controlled, no matter how much power a man believed he possessed. The failed punishment of the twins sent ripples of unease throughout Blackwood Plantation that extended far beyond the slave quarters. In the main house, Master Blackwood found himself unable to concentrate on the ledgers and correspondence that usually occupied his evenings. Instead, he stood at his study window, watching the quarters with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. His wife, Eleanor, had noticed the change in his demeanor. A delicate woman from a prominent Charleston family, she had married Cornelius for his wealth and status, accepting the brutal realities of plantation life as a necessary evil. But the tension that now permeated their home was something new and deeply unsettling. "You've barely touched your dinner," she observed, entering the study with a rustle of silk skirts. "Thomas mentioned there was some trouble with the new slaves today." Blackwood turned from the window, his face drawn with fatigue. "Trouble doesn't begin to describe it, Eleanor. We may have a serious problem on our hands." "Mule." He recounted the events at the punishment post, watching his wife's expression shift from skepticism to alarm. Eleanor was not a superstitious woman, but she had lived in the South long enough to know that some things defied rational explanation. "Perhaps we should contact Reverend Morrison," she suggested. "If there's some sort of spiritual influence at work, he would know how to address it." Blackwood nodded slowly. Reverend Morrison served several plantations in the area and was known for his stern sermons about the divine order that placed white masters over their enslaved workers. If anyone could provide guidance on this unprecedented situation, it would be him. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the twins' presence continued to create subtle but profound changes. Old Sarah, who had initially feared them, found herself drawn to their cabin each evening. She would sit outside their door, listening to the soft humming that seemed to ease the chronic pain in her joints. Other enslaved people began to gather as well, forming a quiet circle around the twins' dwelling. The humming was different each night, sometimes mournful, sometimes hopeful, but always hauntingly beautiful. It seemed to speak to something deep within the listeners, awakening memories of home and family that many had tried to bury in order to survive. Children who had never known freedom found themselves dreaming of vast savannas and flowing rivers. Adults who had forgotten their original names began to remember, but the twins' influence extended beyond comfort and healing. Strange incidents began occurring throughout the plantation with increasing frequency. Tools that had been carefully maintained for years suddenly broke without explanation. Horses became skittish and difficult to control. The cotton gin, a massive machine that was the heart of the plantation's operation, began experiencing mysterious malfunctions that the mechanics couldn't explain. Most disturbing of all were the accidents that befell those who had shown particular cruelty toward the enslaved population. Pike, the assistant overseer who had tried to whip Kaya, developed a painful rash that covered his hands and arms, making it impossible for him to hold his whip. The plantation's doctor could find no medical explanation for the condition, and no treatment seemed to provide relief. Another overseer, a man named Crawford, who was known for his vicious temper, fell from his horse while riding through the fields. The horse, normally docile and well-trained, had suddenly reared without apparent cause, throwing Crawford to the ground with enough force to break his leg in 2 places. As he lay writhing in pain, several enslaved workers reported seeing the twins standing at the edge of the field, watching with their characteristic blank expressions. These incidents created a climate of fear among the white staff that mirrored the unease in the quarters, but for different reasons. The enslaved people feared the twins' power, but also felt a growing sense of hope, perhaps even protection. The overseers and other plantation employees, however, began to suspect that they were being targeted by forces beyond their understanding. Thomas Garrett found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at shadows and unexpected sounds. His sleep was plagued by nightmares in which he was pursued through endless cotton fields by figures he couldn't quite see. During the day, he caught glimpses of the twins watching him from across the fields, their dark eyes seeming to follow his every movement. "They're planning something," he confided to Master Blackwood during their daily meeting. "I can feel it. The way they look at us, the way the other slaves act around them. It's like they're waiting for a signal." Blackwood had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it voiced aloud made the threat seem more real. "What do you recommend?" "Separate them," Garrett said immediately. "Send one to another plantation or sell her off. Whatever power they have, it seems to come from being together." The suggestion had merit, but Blackwood hesitated. The twins' cotton production was exceptional, and their apparent ability to inspire other workers had actually increased overall productivity. From a purely economic standpoint, they were valuable assets. But the growing instability they created threatened the very foundation of his authority. That night, as Blackwood wrestled with his decision, the humming from the quarters took on a different quality. Instead of the usual melodic comfort, there was something urgent in the sound, almost like a warning. Throughout the plantation, people found themselves unable to sleep, drawn to their windows and doorways by an inexplicable compulsion to listen. The humming continued until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, every person at Blackwood Plantation, enslaved and free alike, knew that something fundamental had changed. The twins had been sending a message, though its exact meaning remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that the delicate balance of power that had maintained order at the plantation for decades was crumbling. The twins had introduced an element of uncertainty that no amount of violence or intimidation could control, and everyone sensed that the true test of their influence was yet to come. As Master Blackwood prepared for another day of managing his increasingly unstable domain, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the master of his own plantation. Somewhere in the quarters, two young girls were quietly reshaping the world around them, and he was powerless to stop it. Reverend Morrison arrived at Blackwood Plantation on a grey Thursday morning, his black carriage cutting through the autumn mist like a harbinger of judgment. A tall, gaunt man with piercing grey eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters of any church, he had built his reputation on fierce sermons about divine order and the righteous subjugation of the enslaved population. If anyone could restore spiritual balance to the plantation, Master Blackwood believed it would be him. The Reverend's first stop was the main house, where he met with Blackwood and Eleanor in the formal parlour. As Blackwood recounted the strange events of recent weeks, Morrison listened with the intense focus of a man accustomed to confronting spiritual warfare. His weathered hands remained folded in his lap, but his eyes grew increasingly troubled. "You speak of immunity to physical punishment and unexplained accidents," Morrison said when Blackwood finished. "These are classic signs of demonic influence. The question is whether we're dealing with possession or something more ancestral." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Ancestral? What do you mean?" Morrison's expression darkened. "There are practices among the African peoples, old religions that predate Christianity by thousands of years. Sometimes, when families are torn apart by the slave trade, these spiritual bonds manifest in unexpected ways. Twins, in particular, are considered sacred in many African cultures." Blackwood felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you suggesting these children are practicing witchcraft?" "I'm suggesting they may be conduits for forces they don't fully understand themselves," Morrison replied. "The synchronization you describe, the apparent immunity to harm, the influence over others, these are not natural phenomena." The Reverend insisted on observing the twins before making any definitive judgment. That afternoon, he positioned himself at the edge of the cotton fields, watching Zara and Kaya work with the other enslaved people. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The twins moved through the cotton rows like dancers performing a choreographed routine. Their efficiency was supernatural, but more disturbing was the effect they had on the workers around them. People who had labored in sullen silence for years now worked with a rhythm that seemed almost joyful. They hummed softly as they picked, their voices blending into harmonies that made Morrison's skin crawl. But it was the twins' awareness that truly unnerved him. Despite being focused on their work, they seemed to know exactly where he stood and when he moved. When he shifted position to get a better view, both girls would pause momentarily, their heads turning in his direction with uncanny precision. "They know I'm watching," Morrison murmured to Garrett, who had accompanied him to the fields. "They're aware of everything happening around them, even when they appear to be concentrating on other tasks." Garrett nodded grimly. "It's been like that since they arrived. Sometimes I think they know what I'm going to do before I do it myself." As the afternoon wore on, Morrison noticed other disturbing details. The twins never seemed to tire, while other workers showed the usual signs of fatigue as the day progressed. Their cotton sacks filled at an impossible rate, yet they never appeared to be rushing. Most unsettling of all, the other enslaved people seemed to defer to them in subtle ways, stepping aside when they passed, offering them water first, seeking their approval with quick glances. That evening, Morrison requested permission to speak with the twins directly. Blackwood was reluctant, fearing that direct confrontation might provoke whatever forces protected them, but the Reverend insisted that spiritual assessment required personal interaction. The meeting took place in the plantation's small chapel, a simple wooden building where enslaved people were required to attend Sunday services. Morrison had chosen the location deliberately, believing that consecrated ground would provide some protection and might weaken any unholy influences. Zara and Kaya entered the chapel with their characteristic synchronized movements, showing no sign of discomfort despite the religious setting. They sat in the front pew, their dark eyes fixed on Morrison with an intensity that made him struggle to maintain his composure. "Do you know why I've come to speak with you?" Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority he used in his sermons. The twins remained silent, but their expressions suggested they understood perfectly. Morrison tried a different approach. "I know you're not ordinary children. The things that have happened since your arrival, the immunity to punishment, the influence over others, these are not natural gifts. I want to help you understand what's happening to you." For the first time since entering the chapel, the twins reacted. They tilted their heads simultaneously, studying Morrison with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. Then in perfect unison, they spoke their first words since arriving at the plantation. "We know what we are," they said, their voices blending into a single, haunting sound. "The question is whether you know what you are." Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. The twins' words carried implications that struck at the very foundation of his beliefs. Before he could respond, they continued speaking in their eerie harmony. "You preach about divine order, but you serve the order of men. You speak of salvation, but you bless the chains that bind us. You claim to know God's will, but you have forgotten God's love." The Reverend's hands trembled as he gripped his Bible. "You speak blasphemy. God has ordained the natural order of society. It is not for slaves to question." "We are not slaves," the twins interrupted, their voices carrying a power that seemed to shake the chapel's wooden walls. "We are daughters of the earth and sky, children of ancestors who knew freedom before your ships came. We carry their memories, their strength, their love." Morrison tried to speak, but found his voice had abandoned him. The twins rose from their pew and walked toward the chapel door, their movements as synchronized as always. Before leaving, they turned back to face him one final time. "Your God and our ancestors are not enemies, Reverend Morrison. But you have made yourself an enemy of both by choosing to serve hatred instead of love. When the time comes, you will have to choose again." After they left, Morrison remained in the chapel for nearly an hour, struggling to process what he had experienced. The twins had not denied the spiritual nature of their abilities, but they had reframed the entire situation in terms that challenged everything he believed about divine authority and social order. When he finally returned to the main house, his face was pale and his hands still shaking. Blackwood and Eleanor waited anxiously for his assessment. "Well," Blackwood demanded, "what did you learn?" Morrison stared out the window toward the quarters, where the familiar humming had begun again. "I learned that we may be facing something far more complex than simple demonic possession. These children, they're connected to something ancient, something that predates our understanding of this land and its people. Can you help us?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I'm not sure we should be trying to stop them. What if they're not the problem? What if they're simply revealing problems that were already here?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Blackwood and Eleanor to confront questions they had never wanted to ask. As the humming from the quarters grew stronger, filling the night with its haunting melody, everyone in the main house began to wonder if the twins had come to Blackwood Plantation not as a curse, but as a reckoning. The weeks following Reverend Morrison's visit brought an escalation of tensions that pushed Blackwood Plantation toward an inevitable crisis. The Reverend's words had planted seeds of doubt in Master Blackwood's mind, but his pride and fear of losing control ultimately won out over any spiritual considerations. He decided that the twins represented a threat that had to be eliminated, regardless of the consequences. The plan he devised with Thomas Garrett was simple but brutal. Separate the twins by selling Kaya to a plantation in Alabama, far enough away that their mysterious connection would be severed. If their power truly came from their bond, breaking that bond would restore the natural order to Blackwood Plantation. The decision was made in secret, with only Garrett and a few trusted overseers aware of the arrangement. A slave trader named Marcus Webb had been contacted and would arrive within the week to complete the transaction. Blackwood convinced himself that this was a necessary business decision, nothing more. But the twins seemed to sense the approaching separation long before any official announcement was made. Their behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The humming that had become a nightly ritual in the quarters took on a mournful quality that made listeners weep without understanding why. The other enslaved people grew increasingly agitated, though they couldn't explain the source of their unease. More disturbing were the physical changes occurring throughout the plantation. The cotton plants, which should have been dormant as winter approached, began to wither and blacken as if touched by an invisible blight. The plantation's well water developed a bitter taste that no amount of filtering could remove. Livestock became restless and difficult to manage, with several animals injuring themselves in apparent panic. Master Blackwood tried to dismiss these problems as coincidental, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. The plantation was dying around him, and he suspected the twins were somehow responsible. This only strengthened his resolve to separate them, even as a growing part of him wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. The night before Webb's scheduled arrival, the atmosphere at Blackwood Plantation reached a breaking point. The twins' humming was louder than it had ever been, a sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than from their small cabin. Throughout the quarters, people found themselves unable to sleep, drawn outside by an irresistible compulsion to listen. What they heard was not just music, but something deeper, a calling that spoke to memories buried so deep they felt like dreams. Elderly enslaved people who had been born in Africa began to remember songs their mothers had sung. Others found themselves recalling faces and names they thought they had forgotten forever. The humming was awakening something that had been deliberately suppressed, a connection to identity and heritage that slavery had tried to destroy. In the main house, the effect was equally profound, but far more disturbing. Master Blackwood found himself plagued by visions of the plantation's history, not the sanitized version he told himself, but the brutal reality of lives destroyed and families torn apart. He saw the faces of enslaved people who had died under his father's rule and his own, their eyes filled with an accusation he could no longer ignore. Eleanor experienced her own torment, reliving moments when she had turned away from suffering she could have alleviated, choosing comfort over compassion. The twins' humming seemed to strip away all the justifications and rationalizations that had allowed her to live with the plantation's cruelties. Even Thomas Garrett, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, found himself confronting memories of his own childhood poverty and the desperation that had led him to accept a position where violence was not just tolerated, but required. The humming forced him to see himself as he truly was, not a man maintaining order, but a broken soul perpetuating the same cruelty that had once been inflicted upon him. As dawn approached, the humming finally stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Throughout the plantation, people emerged from their dwellings changed by what they had experienced. The enslaved population moved with a new sense of purpose, while the white staff struggled with emotions they couldn't name or understand. Marcus Webb arrived that morning as scheduled, a coarse man who specialized in the most difficult transactions of the slave trade. He examined Kaya with the detached professionalism of someone who had reduced human beings to mere commodities, noting her youth and apparent health in his ledger. "She'll bring a good price in Alabama," he told Blackwood. "Young, strong, and from what I hear, a hard worker. The buyer I have in mind runs a rice plantation, different kind of work, but she'll adapt." Blackwood nodded, trying to maintain his composure as he watched the twins through his study window. They stood together in the cotton field, their hands clasped, staring directly at the main house with an intensity that made him step back from the glass. "When do you plan to take her?" he asked Webb. "This afternoon. No point in delaying these things. The longer you wait, the more chance there is for trouble." But trouble was already brewing in ways that neither man could anticipate. Word of the planned separation had somehow spread through the quarters, despite the secrecy surrounding the arrangement. The enslaved population was gathering in small groups, their conversations hushed but urgent. Old Sarah, who had become something of a spokesperson for the community, approached the main house with a delegation of the most respected workers. "Master Blackwood," she called from the front porch, her voice carrying a dignity that made him uncomfortable. "We need to speak with you about the twins." Blackwood emerged from the house with Garrett at his side, both men tense and ready for confrontation. "What is it, Sarah?" "You can't separate them, sir. It ain't right and it ain't safe. Those girls, they're special. They're meant to be together. I'll decide what's right on my own plantation," Blackwood replied, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Now get back to work, all of you." Sarah didn't move. Behind her, the other workers stood firm, their faces showing a resolve that Blackwood had never seen before. "With respect, sir, some things are bigger than any one man's plantation. Those twins carry something that belongs to all of us. You separate them, and you'll answer for it." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time in his life, Blackwood was facing open defiance from his enslaved workers, and he knew that traditional methods of control would not be sufficient to address it. The twins had changed everything, awakening a spirit of resistance that could not be beaten into submission. As the confrontation continued, Zara and Kaya walked slowly toward the main house, their synchronized steps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of everyone present. When they reached the edge of the gathering, they stopped and looked directly at Master Blackwood. "You cannot separate what was never truly divided," they said in their haunting unison. "We are one soul in two bodies, one voice in two throats, one heart in two chests. Break our bond, and you break something in yourself that can never be repaired." Webb, who had been watching the scene with growing unease, stepped forward. "Look, Blackwood, maybe we should reconsider this transaction. I've seen situations like this before, and they never end well for anyone involved." But Blackwood's pride would not allow him to back down, even as every instinct told him he was making a catastrophic mistake. "The sale proceeds as planned. Take the girl and go." As Webb moved toward Kaya, the very air around the plantation seemed to hold its breath. What happened next would determine not just the fate of the twins, but the future of everyone at Blackwood Plantation. The moment of reckoning that had been building since their arrival was finally at hand. The moment Marcus Webb's hand touched Kaya's shoulder, the world at Blackwood Plantation seemed to shatter like glass. The sky, which had been overcast all morning, suddenly darkened to an unnatural shade of deep purple, and the wind began to howl through the cotton fields with a ferocity that bent the withered plants nearly to the ground. Zara let out a sound that was part scream, part song, a keening wail that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Every person present felt it in their bones, a vibration that spoke of loss so profound it transcended individual experience and touched something universal. The enslaved workers began to weep openly, while the white staff stepped backward in terror. But the most dramatic change occurred in Kaya herself. As Webb tried to lead her toward his wagon, Her body went completely rigid, and her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries, echoing with the pain of every family torn apart by slavery. "You would break what the ancestors have joined," she said, though her lips barely moved. "You would silence voices that have sung across oceans and through generations. But some bonds cannot be severed by chains or sails or death itself." Webb released her arm as if it had burned him, stumbling backward toward his wagon. "I want no part of this," he shouted to Blackwood. "Keep your money and your cursed slaves. I'm leaving." But as he tried to climb onto his wagon, the horses reared in terror, their eyes rolling white as they fought against their harnesses. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Webb to the ground, and the horses broke free, galloping away across the fields as if pursued by demons. Master Blackwood watched in horror as his carefully ordered world collapsed around him. The enslaved workers were no longer showing him deference or fear. Instead, they formed a protective circle around the twins, their faces showing a determination he had never seen before. Even his own overseers seemed paralyzed by uncertainty, their usual brutality rendered useless against forces they couldn't understand. "This ends now," Blackwood declared, drawing the pistol from his belt. "I am the master here, and I will not be defied by children or superstition." He aimed the weapon at Zara, his hand trembling with rage and fear. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, something extraordinary happened. Every enslaved person in the circle stepped forward simultaneously, placing themselves between the twins and the gun. Old Sarah, despite her age and frailty, stood directly in front of Zara, her arms spread wide. "You want to hurt them, you'll have to go through all of us," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We've lost too much already. We won't lose them too." Behind her, dozens of other voices joined in agreement. Men and women who had been broken by years of brutality found strength they didn't know they possessed. Children who had never known freedom stood beside adults who had forgotten what it felt like. The twins had awakened something that transcended individual survival, a collective spirit that refused to be crushed. Blackwood found himself facing a choice that would define not just his future, but his very soul. He could pull the trigger and massacre his own workforce, destroying everything he had built in a moment of rage, or he could lower the weapon and accept that his absolute authority had been forever shattered. As he hesitated, the twins began to hum again, but this time their melody was different. Instead of the mournful songs that had characterized their previous performances, this was something triumphant, a sound of celebration and liberation that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone who heard it. The enslaved workers began to smile through their tears, while the white staff looked increasingly lost and afraid. The humming grew stronger, joined by other voices from throughout the quarters. People who had been working in distant fields began to appear, drawn by the sound and the sense that something momentous was happening. Soon, nearly the entire enslaved population of Blackwood Plantation had gathered around the twins, their voices blending into a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Eleanor Blackwood emerged from the main house, her face pale with terror. "Cornelius, please," she begged her husband, "put down the gun. This has gone too far." But Blackwood seemed frozen, caught between his pride and his growing realization that he had lost control of everything he had once commanded. The pistol wavered in his hand as he stared at the sea of faces before him, people he had owned, controlled, and brutalized, now standing united in defiance of his authority. It was Thomas Garrett who finally broke the standoff. The overseer, his face haggard from weeks of supernatural torment, stepped forward and gently took the pistol from Blackwood's trembling hand. "It's over, sir," he said quietly. "Whatever power we had here, it's gone. They've taken it from us, and I don't think we're getting it back." As if responding to his words, the twins stepped forward from the protective circle of their supporters. Their eyes had returned to normal, but they carried themselves with a dignity and authority that made them seem far older than their 12 years. "We did not take your power," Zara said, her voice clear and strong. "We simply revealed that it was never truly yours to begin with." Kaya nodded, completing her sister's thought. Power that comes from causing pain is not real power. It is weakness disguised as strength, fear masquerading as authority. The twins looked directly at Blackwood, and for a moment he saw himself reflected in their dark eyes, not as the master he believed himself to be, but as a frightened man who had built his identity on the suffering of others. "You can choose to continue living in fear," the twins said in unison, "or you can choose to learn what real strength looks like. But you cannot choose to go back to the way things were. That world is ending, and a new one is being born." And as if to emphasize their words, the unnatural darkness began to lift from the sky, replaced by a golden light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wind calmed, and the withered cotton plants began to show signs of new growth, their blackened leaves turning green again. The transformation was not just physical, but spiritual. Throughout the plantation, people felt a weight lifting from their shoulders, the weight of accepted cruelty, of normalized brutality, of systems that had seemed unchangeable. The twins had not just challenged the authority of one plantation owner. They had revealed the possibility of a different way of living, but even as hope began to bloom in the hearts of the enslaved population, everyone present understood that this was only the beginning. The twins had awakened something that could not be contained within the boundaries of a single plantation, and the consequences of that awakening would ripple outward in ways that no one could fully predict. The old world was indeed ending, but what would replace it remained to be seen. The only certainty was that Zara and Kaya, the twins who could not be dominated, had changed everything simply by refusing to accept that change was impossible. 6 months after the confrontation that shattered the old order at Blackwood Plantation, the Mississippi Delta had become a very different place. Word of the twins and their extraordinary abilities had spread throughout the region, carried by traders, travelers, and escaped enslaved people who spoke of a plantation where the impossible had become reality. The transformation at Blackwood itself was nothing short of miraculous. Master Cornelius Blackwood, broken by his encounter with forces beyond his understanding, had suffered what the local doctor called a nervous collapse. He spent his days sitting on the manor's porch, staring out at fields that now operated without his oversight or control. The man who had once ruled with absolute authority had become a ghost in his own home. Eleanor Blackwood had initially tried to maintain some semblance of the old system, but she quickly discovered that the enslaved population would no longer accept traditional forms of control. They worked the fields, but as partners rather than property, sharing in the profits and making collective decisions about planting and harvesting. The cotton yield, surprisingly, had increased dramatically under this new arrangement. Thomas Garrett had left the plantation entirely, unable to reconcile his role as an overseer with the new reality. Some of the other white staff had followed him, but others had chosen to stay and adapt to the changing circumstances. They found that treating the formerly enslaved workers as human beings rather than property created a more productive and peaceful environment than the old system of fear and violence. At the center of it all was Zara and Kaya, now recognized as the spiritual leaders of the community. They had grown taller in the months since their arrival, but more importantly, they had grown into their power. The synchronization that had once seemed eerie now appeared natural and beautiful, a visible representation of the harmony they had brought to the plantation. The twins spent their days teaching not just practical skills like reading and writing, which they had somehow acquired despite their youth, but deeper lessons about dignity, community, and the power that came from unity rather than domination. Children who had never been allowed to learn gathered around them eagerly, while adults who had been denied education for decades discovered that it was never too late to begin. But the twins' influence extended far beyond Blackwood Plantation. Other plantations in the region began experiencing their own upheavals as enslaved people, inspired by stories of what had happened at Blackwood, began to demand better treatment and recognition of their humanity. Some plantation owners responded with increased brutality, but others, seeing the writing on the wall, began to negotiate with their workers. The local authorities were deeply troubled by these developments. Sheriff William Hayes had visited Blackwood Plantation several times, trying to understand how the established order had collapsed so completely. Each time he left more confused and unsettled than before, unable to find any legal basis for intervention, but deeply concerned about the precedent being set. "It's not natural," he confided to Judge Marcus Thornton during one of their regular meetings. "Slaves don't just stop being slaves because a couple of children tell them to. There has to be some kind of outside agitation, some abolitionist influence we're not seeing." Judge Thornton, a man who had built his career on maintaining the legal structures that supported slavery, was equally perplexed. "I've reviewed the situation extensively, and I can find no evidence of outside interference. The transformation appears to be entirely internal, which makes it far more dangerous than any external threat." The judge's assessment was accurate. The twins had not brought revolution from outside the system. They had awakened it from within, revealing the inherent contradictions and moral bankruptcy that had always existed at slavery's foundation. Their power lay not in supernatural abilities, though those certainly existed, but in their capacity to help others see themselves and their circumstances clearly. Reverend Morrison had become a frequent visitor to the plantation, drawn by a spiritual crisis that had shaken his faith to its core. The twins' words during their chapel encounter had forced him to confront the gap between the Christianity he preached and the Christianity he practiced. He found himself questioning decades of sermons that had justified oppression in the name of divine order. "I've been thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan," he told the twins during one of his visits. "For years, I focused on the Samaritan's charity, but I never asked why the priest and the Levite passed by. I think I understand now. They were too invested in the system that created the victim's suffering to risk challenging it." The twins listened with the patience they showed all seekers, their dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed impossible in children so young. "Understanding is the first step," Zara replied, "but understanding without action is just another form of passing by." Kaya nodded, adding, "The question is not whether you have been wrong, but whether you will choose to be right from now on." Morrison's transformation became a symbol of the broader changes rippling through the region. Other religious leaders began to question their own roles in supporting slavery, while some plantation owners started to explore alternatives to the traditional system of forced labor. But not everyone was ready to embrace change. A group of the most conservative plantation owners had formed what they called the Committee for the Preservation of Order, dedicated to stopping the spread of what they saw as dangerous ideas. They had petitioned the state government for intervention and were organizing their own response to the crisis. The twins were aware of this growing opposition, but they showed no fear. If anything, they seemed to welcome the challenge, understanding that real change always faced resistance from those who benefited from the status quo. "Change is like birth," they explained to the community during one of their evening gatherings. "It is painful and difficult, and there are always those who would prefer to remain in the darkness of the womb. But once the process begins, it cannot be stopped. A new world is coming, whether we are ready for it or not." As winter gave way to spring, the plantation that had once been a symbol of oppression had become a beacon of hope. Visitors came from across the South and beyond, some seeking to understand the transformation, others hoping to replicate it in their own communities. The twins welcomed them all, sharing their message of unity and human dignity with anyone willing to listen. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the twins themselves. The eerie synchronization that had once marked their every movement had evolved into something more natural and beautiful. They still moved together, spoke together, and seemed to share thoughts and emotions. But now it appeared less like supernatural compulsion and more like the deep harmony that exists between souls who have found their true purpose. On a warm evening in late spring, as the community gathered for their nightly circle around the twins' cabin, Zara and Kaya stood before their followers with expressions of quiet satisfaction. The humming that had once been mournful or urgent was now purely joyful, a celebration of what had been accomplished and what was yet to come. "We came here as children," they said in their harmonious unison, "but we have grown into something more. We came as slaves, but we have become free. We came as strangers, but we have become family." The crowd responded with voices raised in agreement, a chorus of people who had discovered their own power through the twins' example. As the stars appeared overhead and the Mississippi Delta settled into peaceful sleep, everyone present understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new world, one where the bonds of love and community were stronger than the chains of oppression. The macabre case of the Plantation twins had become something else entirely, a story of transformation, hope, and the unbreakable power of the human spirit. The masters who had sought to dominate them had learned that some forces could never be controlled, only respected and celebrated. And in the quiet harmony of their shared song, Zara and Kaya continued to weave the threads of a future where freedom was not just a dream, but a reality that grew stronger with each passing day.